On June 27, 1954, the democratically elected president of Guatemala resigned at gunpoint. He gave a radio address to his country at 9 in the evening. His voice was shaking. He said he was stepping down to prevent further bloodshed. He named the country that had organized his overthrow. He used the word banana. For 43 years, the United States denied that any of it had happened. 6 administrations repeated the same line. Guatemala had overthrown its own government. The Americans had nothing to do with it. Then, in May 1997, the CIA quietly declassified 100,000 pages of internal records. The operation had a name: PBSUCCESS. The budget was about $2.7 million. The chain of command went from the agency's deputy director, Alan Dulles, to a station in Florida, to a pirate radio transmitter in Honduras, to a small force of mercenaries crossing the border in pickup trucks. The country was overthrown for a corporation. The corporation was the United Fruit Company. The Secretary of State himself had been the corporation's lawyer for 38 years. His brother ran the CIA. His brother sat on its board. You weren't taught any of this in school. Almost no American has heard the name Jacobo Árbenz. The story of what happened in Guatemala in 1954 is the story of how American foreign policy was for sale and who was selling it. This is the file. The official version, the one Americans heard for 40 years, went like this. Guatemala, in the early 1950s, was falling under communist influence. The Soviets were moving into Central America. The president, Jacobo Árbenz, was a Soviet puppet. The Guatemalan people, with the help of friendly democratic forces, rose up and removed him. The United States, watching from a distance, was relieved. Eisenhower himself would later write in his memoirs that the events of 1954 were a Guatemalan affair. The State Department line was that the United States had been sympathetic to anti-communist Guatemalans, nothing more. That story held until 1997, when the CIA released the PBSUCCESS files. It held in textbooks, in public statements, in official histories. Now read what the agency itself published. The lead document is called CIA and Guatemala: Assassination Studies. Author, Gerald Haynes, CIA historian. Released June 1995. It includes operational planning memos, target lists, contingency assassination plans, training manuals for mercenaries, and the financial records of the operation. Haynes doesn't hedge. PBSUCCESS was conceived in Washington, approved by Eisenhower in August 1953, planned by the CIA over the following 9 months, funded with American money, executed using Guatemalan exiles and mercenary pilots on the CIA payroll. The government that followed was chosen in advance. The budget paid for pirate radio stations broadcasting fake battle reports, for American pilots flying bombing runs over Guatemala City in unmarked planes, for a liberation army of about 480 men trained in Honduras and Nicaragua, for a list of 58 Guatemalans marked for assassination. That list was, in the end, not executed, but it sat in a CIA safe for years. The man who ran the operation was Frank Wisner, the CIA's deputy director of plans. The man who approved it was John Foster Dulles. The man who ran the agency was Alan Dulles. They were brothers. Both Dulles brothers had built their careers at Sullivan and Cromwell, a Wall Street firm. Their largest client was the United Fruit Company. John Foster had personally negotiated United Fruit's contracts with Guatemala in the 1930s. Alan had sat on the company's board of directors. Their connections to the corporation were not hidden. They were published, in 1954, in newspapers. It just didn't seem to matter. But the harder question is why a fruit company, in 1954, could move the United States government to overthrow a foreign country. To understand that, you have to understand what United Fruit was. By 1950, United Fruit owned more land in Guatemala than any other entity, including the Guatemalan government. It owned 42% of the country's land. Most of that land, about 85%, was not being farmed. It was held in reserve to keep prices high and block competitors. United Fruit owned Guatemala's only major Atlantic port and its only railway, the International Railways of Central America. It owned the country's only telegraph system. It controlled the movement of people, goods, and information across the country. It paid almost no taxes. Concessions going back to 1901 exempted it from import duties, export duties, and property taxes on most of its holdings. The company was not just doing business in Guatemala. It was, functionally, the state. In 1944, a popular uprising overthrew Jorge Ubico, a dictator who had governed Guatemala for 13 years with United Fruit's blessing. What followed was called the Guatemalan Revolution. The country held its first free elections. A university professor, Juan José Arevalo, was elected president. He served a full 6-year term, built schools, and passed a labor code allowing peasants to unionize. He did not touch the fruit company's land. In 1950, Guatemalans elected his successor, a 37-year-old former army colonel named Jacobo Árbenz. Árbenz had campaigned on one promise: land reform. The reform law he passed in June 1952 was called Decree 900. It is the document that, more than anything else, sealed his fate. It expropriated only uncultivated land from large estates. Compensation was paid at the tax value the owners themselves had declared. About 1.5 million acres were redistributed. 500,000 people, in a country of 3 million, received parcels of their own land. About 400,000 of those acres came from the United Fruit Company. The company had declared the land's tax value at $1.2 million. The Guatemalan government offered exactly that amount in compensation. United Fruit refused. The company demanded $16 million. It then went directly to the State Department. Within weeks, the United States government was officially representing the corporation's case to the Guatemalan government. A formal diplomatic note demanded $16 million on behalf of United Fruit, on the grounds that the company's tax declarations had been, in its own words, ridiculously low. Read that line again. The Secretary of State was telling a foreign government that an American corporation had been understating its taxes for decades, and therefore the foreign government must pay it as if it had not. That was the moment Árbenz became, in Washington, a communist. Now someone will say, but he actually was a communist. He had legalized the Guatemalan Communist Party. He had communist advisors. Look at what U.S. intelligence itself was saying. A national intelligence estimate from March 1953 concluded that the Guatemalan Communist Party had 4 members in a Congress of 56 seats. It had no significant influence on the army. The Soviets had no diplomatic presence in Guatemala and had shown no interest in establishing one. The CIA's own analysts told their own government in writing that the communism story did not hold up. Árbenz was a nationalist, educated in a Guatemalan military academy. By background, the closest thing his country had to an establishment figure. He had legalized the Communist Party because his constitution required it. The party had no power. The country had no Soviets. What it had was a fruit company that did not want to pay its taxes. Inside the U.S. government, there were people who tried to slow this down. Ambassador Schoenfeld repeatedly cabled Washington that Árbenz was not a communist threat. He was replaced in October 1953 by John Purifoy, a hardline Cold Warrior. Purifoy met with Árbenz once, for 6 hours, in December 1953. He cabled Washington afterward that Árbenz was either a communist or so naive he might as well be one. The decision had already been made. The cable was the alibi. Inside the CIA itself, there were skeptics. The Intelligence Directorate produced reports questioning whether Árbenz posed any meaningful threat. Those reports were quietly shelved. The operations side, run by Dulles and Wisner, made the decisions. The analysts were told what they had concluded. The man at the center of this story is Jacobo Árbenz himself. He was born in 1913 in a small Guatemalan town. His father was a Swiss-German pharmacist. His mother was a poor Guatemalan woman. The family had no money. Árbenz entered the National Military Academy at 17 because it was free. He graduated first in his class. He served 15 years as an army officer. In 1944, he was one of 3 officers who led the uprising that overthrew Ubico. He could have taken power himself. He didn't. He served as Minister of Defense under Arevalo for 6 years, peacefully. Then ran for president and won fairly. He was 37 years old when he took office. He was not a revolutionary in the romantic sense. He wore suits. He spoke quietly. He had a wife and 3 children. He once described his vision as an economically independent country, one that could feed its own people instead of exporting bananas to American supermarkets. That was the entire program. When the bombing started in June 1954, Árbenz tried to defend his country with the army he had. The army was small, and it had been quietly courted by the CIA for 2 years. Several of its senior commanders had already agreed not to fight. When 480 men crossed the border from Honduras on June 18th, the Guatemalan army didn't move to stop them. The CIA's real weapon was not the invasion force. It was the radio, voice of liberation, broadcasting from Florida and rebroadcast from Nicaragua, told Guatemalans every hour that a massive army was advancing on the capital, that cities were falling, that entire battalions had defected. None of it was true. The 480 men had advanced about 6 miles into Guatemala and then stopped. But the broadcast created the impression of a collapsing country. The senior officers, already in contact with the CIA, refused to deploy. The country fell to a panic that did not match anything happening on the ground. On June 27th, Árbenz resigned. In his radio address that evening, he said, "I have not violated my faith in democratic liberties. I have not betrayed what was always my norm, the independence of Guatemala and all the just aspirations of Guatemalans. I have desired always that the conquests achieved by the October Revolution be consolidated. I have struggled to maintain them. The United Fruit Company, in collaboration with the governing circles of the United States, is responsible for what is happening to us." He named the corporation. He named the government. He used the word fruit. The speech is on record. It broke the official story open even before the files were declassified. Árbenz himself, in real time, told the world what was happening. He went into exile the next day. He spent the rest of his life moving between countries that would have him: Mexico, Switzerland, France, Czechoslovakia, Uruguay, Cuba. He drank heavily. His daughter Arabella killed herself in Bogotá in 1965. Árbenz drowned in a bathtub in Mexico City on January 27, 1971. He was 57. The death was ruled accidental. In 2011, the Guatemalan government formally apologized to his family. His remains were returned to Guatemala City and buried with state honors. By then, the country he had governed for less than 3 years had passed through a 36-year civil war. That war is the part of the story Americans hear about least. After Árbenz fell, Carlos Castillo Armas reversed the land reform within months. He returned the 400,000 acres to United Fruit. He outlawed labor unions. He created secret police. He was assassinated 3 years later, in 1957, by one of his own guards. What followed was 40 years of military dictatorships, coups, and counter-coups. A civil war from 1960 to 1996. The Guatemalan Historical Clarification Commission found the war killed approximately 200,000 people. 40,000 more disappeared. The Commission's report found that 93% of the documented atrocities had been committed by the Guatemalan state. The army carried out 626 massacres of Mayan villages. In some regions, its actions met the legal definition of genocide. The United States supported, trained, and funded successive Guatemalan governments through most of this period. The same army the CIA had cultivated in 1953 became one of the most violent institutions in the Western Hemisphere. In March 1999, President Clinton visited Guatemala City and did something almost no American president has done about a covert operation. He apologized. He said, "Support for military forces which engaged in violence and widespread repression was wrong. The United States must not repeat that mistake." That was the apology. One sentence. He did not name Árbenz, United Fruit, or the Dulles brothers. The PBSUCCESS files, declassified 2 years earlier, were not mentioned. They sit today in the CIA's online reading room. Any American can read them, almost no one does. Put the evidence side by side. In 1950, a 37-year-old former Army colonel was elected president of Guatemala in a free election. In 1952, he passed a land reform that took unused land from a foreign corporation at the price the corporation itself had declared. In 1953, the corporation went to the State Department. The Secretary of State was the corporation's former lawyer. His brother ran the CIA and sat on the company's board. The CIA's own analysts said the country was not a Soviet threat. The agency overthrew the government anyway. The new government returned the land. The country entered a 40-year war that killed 200,000 people.